Oops.
Wonderful. Let me share the screen and we will get started. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to also thank you for giving me the opportunity to use the title that I had originally hoped to use for the monograph, which for various boring reasons ended up with Tennyson's philological medievalism. Um, the phrase many fine old words comes from a memoir, the memoir written by Tennyson's son Hallam, in a footnote to a remark on the Idylls of the King. And Hallam writes, if he differentiated his style from that of any other poet, he would remark on his use of English, in preference to words derived from French and Latin. He revived many and fine old words which had fallen into disuse, and I heard him regret that he never employed the word yearly, which, in case you're not familiar, is an Anglo-Saxon word meaning quickly. This quotation encapsulates several of the themes of my book, the highlights of which I've tried to compress into this talk. So, needless to say, I'll be touching on some topics quite briefly. I've left out some others altogether, so we're not here all day. But I'm happy to go deeper on anything that's of interest during our discussion afterward. So, how and why did Tennyson develop a style in which he identified its distinguishing characteristic as a preference for Germanic vocabulary and a dedication to reviving old words that had fallen out of use? In addition to being very well read in terms of his literary forebears, he came of age in the midst of the explosive growth in popularity of both Anglo-Saxonism and philology, and he did so among men who were to be responsible for advancing both fields. The beginning of his poetic career coincided with a shift in how linguistic study was pursued from a system that began with a philosophical stance and then proceeded to look for evidence to a process that began with observation and comparison. The conclusions that scholars drew from this new type of research aroused both anxiety and excitement and provoked wide-ranging debate over what the history of language revealed about the human condition. Charles Darwin and Max Muller, for example, invoked philology in correspondence with each other to to argue both for and against evolution, respectively. Charles Darwin obviously being saying that it supported his case and Muller feeling the opposite. As a result, the upper and middle classes of 19th century England became increasingly interested in the origins of words and the changes that languages had undergone. Tennyson was exposed to the early English texts of a wide range and contemporary philological theories through the books he read and the acquaintances he made as a student at Cambridge and beyond. And his knowledge of historical English, though amateur, was extensive. Returning to Hallam Tennyson's remark on his father's style, it's no coincidence that it appears in the context of commentary on the medievalist idylls, for medievalism, philological knowledge, and literarily derived archaism are intimately bound up together. It's very hard to say one thing is the result of one, but not the other sort of pillars of that group of ideas. Philologists and medievalists, who were sometimes the same people, reinforced and made possible each other's work. One of the early luminaries of the so-called New Philology was the German scholar Jacob Grimm, that is to say, half of the brothers Grimm, who was drawn into language history by way of researching the history of law. In 1819, he published the first volume of his Deutsche Grammatik, or German grammar. This work, especially in its revised second edition of 1822, proposed a set of rules that describes how sounds within words change over time. These sound change laws explain, for example, why English has what and father, while the Latin equivalents are quod and pater. Though others had noted some of the same sound changes, Grimm expanded the observations into a systematic schema known to this day as Grimm's Law. The British scholarly community resisted New Philology, in part because it developed largely in Germany. But one of its early toeholds in England was Trinity College, Cambridge. And this was thanks in large part to Trinity tutor Julius Charles Hare, who taught and mentored members of the Conversazione Society, commonly known as the Cambridge Apostles, who counted Tennyson among their members. Officially for a very brief time, but sort of unofficially they considered him one of their own for the rest of his life. Collectively, the group was inclined toward Germanic ideas, and indeed the apostles were on the leading edge of the eventual Victorian enthusiasm for all things so-called Teutonic. Two apostles from Tennyson's time became deeply involved in language study. John Mitchell Kemble, who became a pioneering Anglo-Saxon scholar, and Richard Chenevix Trench, who went on to write popular works on philology, as well as influencing the Philological Society, most notably by proposing the project that became the New English Dictionary and subsequently renamed the Oxford English Dictionary. The budding Anglo-Saxonist Kemble, with whom Tennyson was especially friendly in the years immediately following university, spent time in Germany learning the new approach to historical and comparative linguistics, corresponded regularly with Jacob Grimm, and was a passionate advocate for new philology all his life. He edited the first English publications of Beowulf, the Old English text in 1833 and a translation in 1837, as well as publishing a two-volume history of the Anglo-Saxons, a pamphlet on their runes, 6 large volumes of their charters that remained authoritative for the better part of a century, editions of various other texts, and, near the end of his life, articles on archaeology. Trench's work was much broader and more broadly accessible, aiming to educate the public about the importance of studying the accumulated social history behind their words. New philology shared methodologies, thought models, and even similes with geology and biology, but its popularizers, like Trench and Mueller, fended off the existential fear that could attend upon those subjects by emphasizing the wonders to be found within the seemingly ordinary words of everyday speech. And they're extremely quotable. It's you have to work hard not to just fill your paper with lots of quotations from these men, and Trench in particular. They also argued that the history of a language's changes opened up windows into the whole history of the people who had spoken it. Language, Trench wrote, was a storehouse of so much unconscious wisdom. And here's one of his many quotable descriptions. Just as in some fossil, curious and beautiful shapes of vegetable or animal life, the graceful fern or the finely vertebrated lizard, such as now it may be, have been extinct for thousands of years, are permanently bound up with the stone and rescued from that perishing which would have otherwise been theirs. So in words are beautiful thoughts and images, the imagination and the feeling of past ages, of men long since in their graves, of men whose very names have perished, these, which would have so easily perished too, preserved and made safe forever. We must be cautious, of course, not to conflate the views of Tennyson's friends with his own, but it's abundantly evident that Kemble, Trench, and Tennyson were formed part of a group that took words seriously, contributing to Tennyson's understanding of language at an important stage in his poetic development. Moreover, his interest in the subject continued unabated for the rest of his life. His diary from an 1846 trip to the continent, for example, records that he, quote, talked about language with Germans, unquote. Sadly, there's no more details about that conversation, but it's tantalizing. Nearly 2 decades after that, now in his mid-50s, he copied out a table of Grimm's Law into one of his notebooks. This table, and it took me a while to figure out where he'd gotten it, this table exactly matches the general table of Grimm's Law in Friedrich Max Müller's second series of Lectures on the Science of Language, published in 1864. And the dating of the notebook indicates that Tennyson read these lectures soon after they appeared in print and was still curious enough about comparative grammar that he copied out a highly technical schema for his own reference. As for his knowledge of the history of English in particular, he owned or consulted most of the major scholars, books by most of the major scholars who were bringing the Anglo-Saxons into public consciousness, including Sharon Turner's enduringly popular History of the Anglo-Saxons, published in the years straddling the turn of the 19th century. In fact, marginalia in his copy of Turner's history show the poet selecting specific passages that he apparently intended to use for his own writing. These passages are taken from the story of the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity, with Turner paraphrasing Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people. So a few examples I've thrown in here. He's kind of marked along the sides with sort of sidebars the sections that he wants to use, and then he's numbered them. So we've got a 3 on the left, a 4 on the right, and you can see section 3 was originally going to cover the entirety of the right side page, and then he's decided to make a cut. So it's sort of slashed through that and written omit on the left and the right margins. And at the bottom of the page, we're told to turn the page because it keeps going. And since he then cut it, it's now 2 sections, not 1, so it's numbers 3 and 4. And then we skip ahead. Here's section, it was originally going to be his 6th selection, but now it's number 7. And he's written 1 speaker on the side, and that's because the king has asked his advisors, should we convert to Christianity? And 2 people give a response, a priest and an alderman. And Tennyson evidently decided that to simplify the narrative, it was just going to be 1 person making both of their arguments. So this is really interesting to find scribbled in there, but he didn't actually make this narrative poem a reality, so we'll never know quite what he intended to do with it. Um, Tennyson ultimately never made the story into a narrative poem, but he was seriously engaged in study of Old English at various times throughout his career. Indeed, one of his notebooks, watermarked from 1828, which was while he was still a student, contains a brief translation of several lines from Beowulf. It's a short translation, but at the time it was a rare young man who would have been aware of the text, and certainly even a rarer person who was interested and equipped to help translate it for himself directly. It was mostly available in sort of little snippets, as sort of quotations in various texts and compendiums. A decade and a half after his notebook translation, he received as a gift Rasmus Rask's Grammar of the Anglo-Saxon Tongue, as translated. The original text was not in English, but translated into English by Kemble's friend and colleague Benjamin Thorpe. And this copy shows undeniable evidence of use. Most prominently, and I had great joy in finding this, in the midst of a passage from King Alfred's Boethius, as it's called in the book, which is to say the Old English translation of On the Consolation of Philosophy, a flame has burned through the corner of about 20 pages. And my best guess is because Tennyson was myopic, that he was holding his book a little too close to the light and it started to catch fire, which suggests to me that he was still interested in the language years later, years after his university translation. And that fascination was still going strong as the poet approached old age. Around 1877, he wrote a translation of the Old English poem now known as the Battle of Brunanburg, in collaboration with his son Hallam, who had published a prose translation the year before. In short, the evidence is overwhelming that Tennyson was interested and well educated about the history of the English language. In this context, the question driving my research was, what effect does it have on a poet to be steeped in historical versions of his language and to believe in the wisdom and power hiding within the history of his words? Well, most prominently, as we've already heard, Tennyson employed many fine old words which had fallen into disuse, which his reviewers, by the way, did not approve of. The Spectator, for example, complained of, quote, a great fondness for old words, unquote, in his 1830 collection. It's well documented that, as his grandson Charles put it, quote, Tennyson often stored observations and similes for long periods before finally working them into his poems, unquote. And we heard at the top that he regretted that he never managed to work yearly into anything. And in a similar fashion, he stored up antiquated words for later use. In a notebook from his days at Trinity, he devoted more than 90 pages to creating his own repository of literary words from across the history of the English language. This is an example page. The glossary contains words out of sources ranging from Anglo-Saxon texts up through Chapman's Homer. It was both a reading aid and an anthology of terms that appealed to him, some of which he then reused in his poetry. And just a plug that if you really want to know what all else is in that glossary, you could take a look at the monograph that the Tennyson Society was kind enough to help me put out there into the world. And you can sort of try to reconstruct what he had been reading, because he's got quotations and very specific ways that he defines things, and you can sort of see what he was reading to make this, and then how some of it filtered through into reusing those fine old words in his own writing. Um, and his friends were aware, clearly, of this affinity, and they would send him words that they thought he might like. Shortly after they had left Cambridge, for example, Arthur Hallam wrote to Tennyson about his law studies, quote, I read Blackstone and rather enjoy the old fellow. Even you would like some things in him. For instance, such a word as forestal, a legal adjective from forest. As far as I can tell, he misread that word, but that's not the point. The point is that he thought Tennyson would like this sort of unusual word, and maybe he might want to do something with it. Citing examples of Tennyson's philological choices is challenging. I'm going to say this right up front, not because they're rare, on the contrary, but because they're small, literally at the scale of single word choices, and scattered throughout the corpus. So listing them can quickly become rather tedious. But to give a sense of how he employed fine old words, we can turn to the 1832 version of The Miller's Daughter, which opens with a stanza that describes the wealthy miller's mealy face, like the moon in an ivy tod. Ivy tod, which Tennyson used again 40 years later in the Idle Balin and Balan, was archaic enough that his friend T.H. Rawnsley evidently told the poet that he'd never heard the term. Tennyson wrote back, "You never heard the word ivy tod, but you have heard of tods of wool, and I take it they are the same words originally, a certain weight or mass of something." Now, as it happens, between the first publication of The Miller's Daughter, as shown here, and Tennyson's letter to Rawnsley, Charles Richardson's dictionary defined tod as a certain measure of wool or a bush, a thicket. And that dictionary quotes Spencer using the phrase "eviatod." I've sort of put the red box around it there. And this suggests to me that perhaps the Victorian poet, well, we know he would have known as Spencer, and he may have borrowed the term directly from there. But in any case, hey, you can see him sort of in his letter doing a little bit of amateur philology there, saying, noticing the equivalent, sort of extrapolating the original meaning. And indeed, where his archaic terminology could be questioned, and it was questioned, he could usually point to a historic poetic precedent, or at least he knew it in his mind. He knew that it was justified because he had usually come across it himself. As another example, the speaker of a dirge addresses the buried body of a loved one, saying that they are beyond worldly worries. And there's a line that goes, "Thee nor carketh care nor slander." Now, the sentence combines a fairly medieval grammatical construction with the conspicuously archaic word carketh. The OAD gives Tennyson's lines as the only example from after 1400. His footnote in the Eversley edition defines the word carketh as vexeth. And at the time of the poem's composition, neither Tennyson's dictionaries that he had on hand at that time defined the word in a way that matches this use. And Johnson's dictionary had explicitly declared that the verb cark was, quote, "now very little used," unquote, as of 1755. So a good while before it was already very little used, and archaic sometime before this composition. However, William Langland's medieval poem, Piers Plowman, which Tennyson cited frequently in his notebook, used the phrase overcark in a sort of similar way. It's likely he had mentally noted down the word. It's not in the written glossary, but I'm guessing he mentally noted it from Langland or a similar historic reading and revived it as a fine old word. Tennyson's love of archaic and unusual language also manifested in historical rhymes that only work with older pronunciation. The 1832 Poems, which is Tennyson's second independent collection, contained a specimen of light verse that lauded the comfort of the speaker's room at home, saying that nothing he had seen in his travels could compare. It began, "O darling room, my heart's delight, dear room, the apple of my sight, with thy two couches soft and white, there is no room so exquisite, so little room so warm and bright, wherein to read, wherein to write." I'll say right up here at front, it's not considered one of his masterpieces, but in particular, the word exquisite, placed in the center of lines with relentlessly matching end rhymes, poses a dilemma for the phonetic harmony we want it to have. In his brutally mocking review of the volume, J.W. Croker seized upon this moment to land an extra blow, writing, "We have ourselves visited all these celebrated spots, and can testify in corroboration of Mr. Tennyson that we did not see any of them anything like this little room so exquisite." In reviewing the same volume, the Athenaeum found that the beauty of Tennyson's poetry was, quote, "disfigured and sometimes absolutely concealed by obsolete pronunciation," among other faults that they mentioned. Responding to the poet's previous collection, the Spectator had likewise complained of, quote, "a love for old modes of pronunciation," unquote. The Westminster Review had had mostly good things to say about it, but quibbled, quote, "We must protest against the use of antiquated words and obsolete pronunciation in which our author indulges so freely." Now, despite the disconnect between writing and speech, an issue which, by the by, definitely preoccupied Tennyson in its own right, the rhyme scheme here forces the reviewers, and elsewhere in other poems, forces the reviewers to hear these obsolete pronunciations or to speak them if they're reading the poetry aloud, which of course lots of people did at the time. It draws attention to the changes wrought by time in the language. These rhymes don't work, but we want them to, and they don't work because pronunciation has changed. They tended to see, let's say, the reviewers tended to see or interpret these rhymes as Tennyson being too much in love with writers of the past and simply copying their style in a way that wasn't justified in the 19th century. But Tennyson didn't just appreciate or imitate earlier poets by using verbal antiquities. Philology emphasize the power of understanding modern day language by means of its history. And I argue that the same can be said of Tennyson's poetry. It uses the past, but is not enslaved to it. Hand in hand with his love of fine old words, for example, a love of provincial and dialect words can be found in Tennyson's work. W.E.H. Lecky recalled of Tennyson, he had a strong sense of the force and rhythm of words, and his knowledge of Old English and of vivid provincial expressions was very great. How infinitely superior, he said, is the provincial word flittermouse to the orthodox bat. And this was no hypothetical example. The sailors in The Voyage of Muldoon encounter an enchanted silent isle where, quote, our voices were thinner and fainter than any flittermouse shriek. And it's no coincidence that Lecky mentions Old English and provincial expressions as two sides of the same coin. It was a common refrain among Victorian scholars that rural regions often preserved aspects of medieval life, including vocabulary. Whereas the fashionable segments of the population followed fashion into all sorts of linguistic corruptions, the argument went, the people of the countryside did not stray so far from their roots. Tennyson was curious and studious about dialects as well as other aspects of his language. In addition to writing 7 poems fully in the dialect of his childhood county, he also incorporated regional vocabulary into his other poems. He liked these vivid provincial expressions, as Lecky put it, and his annotations show that he generally knew which regions his dialect words came from and used them to reflect the settings of his poems. For example, he glossed pike in the poem Ode to Memory as, quote, a Cumberland word for peak. In Locksley Hall, the line, the many-wintered crow leads the clanging rookery home, apparently conflates two different bird species. Tennyson's choice to use dialect in this case must have earned him some criticism that either continued for decades or still annoyed him 55 years later, because he defended himself in a letter to Walter Theodore Watts in 1892 by citing his personal knowledge of Lincolnshire speech. In my county, and I believe all through the north, rooks are called crows. I am not such a ninny as not to know a crow from a rook. Accuse me if you like of provincialism, but not of ignorance in this matter. So that's us told off. He made the point again and more publicly in the Eversley edition, which informs readers that, quote, rooks are called crows in the northern counties, unquote. The imaginary hall in this poem, Locksley Hall, is located in just such a northern county, making the provincialism especially appropriate. All of these techniques, archaic words, rhyme-enforced old pronunciation, regional vocabulary, serve to make the language of Tennyson's poems stand out for you to take notice of the language itself. And even when using more common words, his style shows a dedication to defamiliarizing them or using them in ways that you don't expect. He achieved this by using archaic meanings for them and also alluding to their literal etymological metaphor. For example, Tithonus is a poem in which it's written in the voice of a man who has been granted immortality without eternal youth. He asks regretfully, why should a man desire in any way to vary from the kindly race of men, or pass beyond the goal of ordinance, where all should pause as is most meet for all? The phrase kindly race of men makes most sense with the knowledge that the adjective comes from the same root as kin, and is being used here to mean of the same species, as Johnson's dictionary had put it. Tithonus does not mourn the pleasant, friendly race of men, but he regrets becoming something different, a different kind of creature than a man. In fact, an earlier draft of this poem had gone like this: why should a man desire in any shape to vary from his kind? In the next line, goal can only really mean a boundary or a limit. And indeed, the Eversley edition, I've referred to it several times. It's an edition annotated by Tennyson and his son. And it glosses goal of ordinance as appointed limit. This is a definition for which the OED cites only 2 examples from 1350 and 1647. Now, 4 dictionaries that Tennyson used, including one that I've sort of given you a picture of here, they thought that the word goal came from French gaul, or a pole, which being set in the ground was the place to run to. So it sort of makes more sense with that sense of it as a limit or a finish line. Although the OED now asserts that, quote, there is no evidence that the English goal ever meant pole, unquote, Tennyson used it as such We saw it a bit in the previous poem, and then he used it again in Tiresias. In this case, the life-weary prophet looks forward to an afterlife where his eyes will find the men I knew and watch the chariot whirl about the goal again. Now, ancient chariot races, as these lines suggest, took place around two turning posts, which were stuck in the ground and which the chariots whirled about. And thus the word goal in this context regains its supposed etymological meaning. And as it turns out, that meaning may have been wrong, but they believed it was correct at the time that he was using it. Uh, the appeal of etymology across time is the possibility of revealing the now forgotten metaphor or real meaning, if you like, that of the ideas that were originally fused into a word. So you get sort of two separate ideas that become a single combination and become a word, which then over time we forget about the metaphor that was built into it. Revealing those metaphors is another hallmark of Tennyson's philological style. It stems from an idea that Trench articulated well, though he was but one of many who shared this view, namely that words are miniature poems. Many a single word is itself a concentrated poem, having stores of poetical thought and imagery laid up in it. Poetry, which is passion and imagination embodying themselves in words, does not necessarily demand combined words for this. Of this passion and imagination, a single word may be the vehicle. As the sun can image itself alike in a tiny dewdrop or the mighty ocean, so the spirit of poetry can dwell in and glorify alike a word and an Iliad. On every side we are beset with poetry. Well, if a single word contains a poem within itself, then poets have available an additional level of metaphor, allowing further suggestiveness, precision, or, indeed, contradiction or ambiguity. Tennyson was adept at making the dewdrop of a word's etymological meaning engage with the mighty ocean of the poem in which he placed it, either mirroring or troubling the statements that it makes. He does so, it will be no surprise to absolutely no one here, he does this to brilliant effect in In Memoriam. For example, when Tennyson describes Hallam ere our fatal loss, the sense of fatal hovers between the ordinary sense of Hallam's death and the etymological origin of the term as fated. Was he destined to be lost? Similarly, the poem's obsession with the word strange reflects, in its etymological sense, Hallam having moved to the undiscovered country of whatever lies beyond death. These moments consist of philological puns, essentially. We read, therefore, that no spirit ever break the band that stays him from the native land where first he walked when clasped in clay. The fact that native etymologically signifies where one was born becomes prominent through the infant imagery of where first he walked. And combined with, of course, the contrast between birth and death that is sort of bound up in this, well, the entire poem, but this section in particular. When the speaker seems to fail from out my blood and grow incorporate into the churchyard yew tree, that's our sort of second quote on the left there, incorporate becomes sort of a pun between combined and bodiless. He's sort of becoming a bodiless ghost, but then becoming incorporated into the yew tree. And this wordplay may have suggested itself to Tennyson from whatever reading it was, I wasn't able to identify it, that caused him to write in his college notebook a little phrase, incorpsed, incorporate. When section 18 is glad that Hallam's bones may lie in English soil, as at the top right quote, among familiar names and in the places of his youth, the root of familiar tells us that his body rests both in a place well known to Hallam and that he literally is interred among the grave markers of his family. Perhaps most pointedly of all, the mourner, the speaker of In Memoriam, dreams of boarding a ship, where he meets Hallam again, and they sail off together, quote, while the wind began to sweep a music out of sheet and shroud. An editor's note may tell us that sheet and shroud refer to types of rope on a ship, but in an elegy, and one that repeatedly meditates on the subject's physical remains, they cannot help but evoke the idea of burial garments. As these examples illustrate, Tennyson put to work the multiplicity of possible meanings that can accompany a single word. In Memoriam, such possibilities complicate any apparently confident statement, which is a useful effect in a composition that has an ambivalent relationship to religion. At the same time, linguistic ambiguity can act as a partial solution for religious doubt because it evades a fixed doctrine that might inhibit any belief at all. So you can never sort of make a firm statement, which is both useful and not useful for the speaker. In section 41, the speaker worries that he will no longer be Hallam's companion, quote, though following with an upward mind the wonders that have come to thee through all the secular to be. The Eversley edition annotation glosses secular to be as eons of the future. And per this interpretation, the poem is using secular in a sense derived from Latin for an age, a really long time. This meaning echoes the Latin version of the Gloria Patri of the church service, that is to say, in secula seculorum, i.e., forever and ever. But secular can also mean, and as Tennyson used it later in his play Queen Mary, non-religious. And as a side note, the OED uses Tennyson as an example of both these two kinds of meanings for secular. So this materialist sense remains present, troubling the assurance that the lines seem to offer. In Memoriam shows how Tennyson could use his knowledge of historical English to write about a contemporary experience, just as the past lives within the present form of the words we speak. Similarly, when he invented new words, or new senses of existing words, he did so while remaining grounded in history. As of 2024, when I finished writing this book, the online edition of the OED cited Tennyson's poetry as the first documented use of 87 words, and the first evidence of a particular meaning for a staggering 631 more. As of this week, about a couple days ago, I looked again, and he's now cited as the first quotation for 383 words, which is quite a jump from 87. I'm not quite sure what happened there. At a first glance, it looks like a lot of them are sort of double-barreled adjectives, compound adjectives, which is a whole section of the book I don't have time to talk about today. And I'd be very curious what got him such a big jump in responses there. But nonetheless, the point stands that he innovated his words in addition to borrowing from the past. And he's now shown as the first use of a meaning of a word for 608, which is a slight drop from a year and a half ago. The story of Tennyson's representation in the OED is partly one of 19th century taste. It is, in fact, a 19th century production originally, of course, and of canon formation. Who's worthy of quoting is a whole story that, again, we do not have time to delve into today. But I would argue that he's also quite good at using a word in a way that helps illustrate its meaning. You have a limited space in the OED to show how a word is being used, and he was quite good at doing that. And it's a crucial aspect as well of using words that will be alien to the reader and trying not to lose your reader in the poem. Thus, the speaker of supposed confessions of a second-rate sensitive mind agonizes over his lack of faith, likening himself to, quote, a full-sailed skiff unpiloted in the echoing dance of reboant whirlwinds. Taken from classical Latin, reboant tells us that the whirlwinds are literally rebellowing, which is to say they are resounding, reverberating, or echoing loudly. This is the first example cited by the OED, and Tennyson helps define his neologism with echoing dance in the preceding line. So just to hear it again, the echoing dance of reboant whirlwinds. Of course, stretching language beyond the everyday always carries a risk of confusing the reader, and indeed, a review of the 1832 volume objected to the, quote, picturesque coinages, unquote, that interfered with his meaning, at least according to that reviewer. 23 years later, the following passage from Maud provoked critical consternation. When the happy yes falters from her lips, pass and blush the news or the blowing ships. Over blowing seas, over seas at rest, pass the happy news, blush it through the west. At least two reviewers criticized this use of the word blowing in relation to ships. One of them called it unpardonable. The other was baffled, asking, what is the meaning of a blowing ship? Tennyson later changed the line to glowing ships, but he seems to have been reusing a sense that he had coined 20 years earlier. He is the first two OED quotations for the verb blow in the sense, quote, to be driven or carried by the wind, to move before the wind, unquote. Now, those quotations that the OED has from Tennyson are from the 1842 volume and from the poems The Goose and the Daydream. As a final example, Tennyson adapted a familiar word in the poem The Goose. The poor old woman in the story grows rich from the goose's golden eggs, quote, until the grave churchwarden doffed, the parson smirked and nodded, unquote. The churchwarden acknowledges the woman's newfound respectability by doffing, a word that is usually transitive, that is, it takes a direct object. Presumably, the churchwarden doffs his hat, but the object is not named, and the verb appears in parallel with the intransitive ones smirked and nodded. Tennyson's dictionaries from the period only recorded transitive uses of the word. His intransitive application of doff, therefore, was unusual. In fact, it did not appear in the OD when my book came out, not that long ago, though it's now there as of a few days ago. Um, and it's there with a citation from 1674, and then this line from Tennyson. Adding to the complexity of this issue, Johnson had proclaimed in the middle of the 18th century, quote, this word, doff, in all its senses is obsolete and scarcely used except by rustics. Yet it is a pure and commodious word. So the poet then took an obsolete word that had become provincial and adapted it to a new use. Thus, the churchwarden's doffing represents sort of the larger story of Tennyson's philological style, all in one little word. Okay, so thus far we've glanced at how Tennyson worked with the echoes of history within individual words. Philologists popularized the idea that words contain within themselves traces of the history of the society that spoke them. In the case of English, the corpus as a whole tells the story of the Norman conquest. Essentially, modern English is the result of the Norman French of William the Conqueror and his people interacting with the Old English of the Anglo-Saxons, with subsequent borrowing directly from Latin and a few other languages. As English society became more invested in defining itself through its early language and literature over the course of the 19th century, some of Tennyson's contemporaries advocated for returning to the Germanic rootstock of English. Straightforward nationalistic pride claims partial credit for this phenomenon, as does the idea that only Old English and its cognates conveyed ideas more powerfully and more picturesquely, and in other words, were sort of closer to their original metaphors. The Cambridge Apostles partook of this enthusiasm to an extent. As Marion Shaw has put it, an English quality in poetry was a strong element in the Apostles' valuation, a desire to confirm links with a traditional past that seemed to be disappearing, and to provide a bulwark against an uncertain future. That's Marion Shaw. And indeed, Tennyson's poetry shows a commitment to weighting his vocabulary in favor of words of Anglo-Saxon heritage. As we heard at the beginning of this talk, his son reported that he would remark on his use of English in preference to words derived from French and Latin. We can take, for example, the poem The Lotus Eaters, which was widely praised and continued to be a point of reference for decades for those wishing to cite Tennyson's powers at their best. Given the story's origin in the Odyssey, a surprisingly high percentage of the poem is composed of words with Germanic roots. Only 13% of the total word stock is of French or Latin origin, or 14% if you want to remove articles and pronouns, since you don't have a lot of choice about using those. Now, by way of context, English as a whole is estimated to be composed of approximately 60% French or Latin vocabulary, though that includes technical and medical terms, which are heavily Latinate. So in writing, on average, percentages generally come out to half and half. A study of Jane Austen's corpus found about 36% Latinate verbiage. So Tennyson's 13 does seem to be the result of concerted effort. And the following passage demonstrates how Tennyson could manage with minimal Latinate vocabulary. Lo, in the middle of the wood, the folded leaf is wooed from out the bud, with winds upon the branch, and there grows green and broad and takes no care, sun steeped at noon, and in the moon, nightly dew fed, and turning yellow, falls and floats adown the air. Within these lines, only branch is non-Germanic. The poem overall averages about one Latinate word per line for 173 lines, with up to 5 consecutive lines managing without any at all. Yet he did all this without sacrificing tone, and that's where I think Tennyson really stands out as compared to some of his contemporaries. This poem is not austere or simply picturesque. On the contrary, it abounds in lush, sensual descriptions. In my very kind introduction, Val mentioned the work I did creating a comparison between Tennyson and William Morris, who both had a sort of medievalist interest in the Germanic part of their vocabulary, but Morris sort of takes it to an extreme where it's very austere, I think is my favorite word for that. Now, importantly, the solution for Tennyson and his friends was not to turn back time to some period of imagined pure English. Kemble, for example, wrote to Jacob Grimm in 1852, this is Tennyson's friend who's the Anglo-Saxonist. I could wish that in my own language we had retained a little more of the sound Anglo-Saxon element, but I cannot regret those changes which formed the tongue in which Shakespeare and Milton wrote, and which Alfred Tennyson writes. Only I am myself careful to use an English word whenever I justly can, in preference to a French or Latin one. Similarly, Tennyson was not interested in returning to a solely native word stock. Arthur Hallam, in his review of Tennyson's 1830 collection, wrote that his friend's language, with one or two quote, with one or two rare exceptions, is thorough and sterling English, unquote. But thankfully, he wrote, we see no signs in what Mr. Tennyson has written of the quixotic spirit which has led some persons to desire the reduction of English to a single form, by excluding nearly the whole of Latin and Roman derivatives. Ours is necessarily a compound language. As such alone, it can flourish and increase. According to Hallam's judgment, it was right and good that Tennyson embraced that, quote, that fertility of expression and variety of harmony, unquote, that came from Latinate components. Another of Tennyson's friends, who's cited only as Mrs. Montague Butler, likewise recalled that he, quote, spoke of the great richness of the English language due to its double origin, the Norman and Saxon words. And he made, unquote, and he made use of that richness by bringing together words of varying origins. As Joseph Bosworth observed in his 1838 Anglo-Saxon dictionary, the fact is that many thousand foreign words have been introduced when native terms already existed, and the English has in this way been endowed with the power of expressing the same idea by two different words, or, what is of still greater value, of appropriating this new word to mark some modification in the meaning of the indigenous word. Tennyson leveraged the nuances of meaning made possible by a word hoard stocked from multiple sources. Sometimes he employed English's multiplicity in the form of synonyms, bordering on redundancy. For example, the mariners of the Lotus Eaters ask, why should we toil? Why should we only toil the roof and crown of things? Roof and crown are Anglo-Saxon and Latinate equivalents. Phrases such as this duplicate the core meaning of the synonyms and also comprehend within them any sort of shades of meaning that they might slightly differently have. And as a fun side note, this use of roof and crown, is actually then subsequently used in an Anglo-Saxon dictionary to help readers understand the Anglo-Saxon word hroff, which is where roof comes from. So I find it fantastic that he's sort of come full circle and is helping to define Anglo-Saxon words. Outside of such pairings, he selected his words and their attendant registers thoughtfully, using Latin and French vocabulary sparingly but effectively to achieve calculated effects. Mrs. Butler noted, for example, and going back to the first quote on this slide, that he knew that a baby crying in the night would have sounded ridiculous, while an infant crying in the night did not. And furthermore, as a number of scholars have recognized, the etymological sense of infant is infans, unable to speak, which is very fitting in a moment in which In Memoriam's mourner calls himself an infant crying in the light for the light and with no language but a cry. So he's again pulled out that etymological meaning. It would be far too simplistic to say that Victorian philology created Tennyson's style, but it equipped him to use these techniques and to believe in their value and their importance. He needed that conviction because reviewers generally did not approve of language in his poems that stood out as unusual. The Athenaeum Review of the 1832 collection lamented that he too often strayed from the simplicity of style that they thought brought out his best work. So strong indeed seems to be Mr. Tennyson's love of singularity, that either that which is antiquated or that which is palpable innovation possesses an irresistible charm for him, and accordingly his poetry is marred and its beauty disfigured and sometimes absolutely concealed, not only by discarded phrase and obsolete pronunciation, but by words newly compounded after the German model. And again, I didn't really have time to go into compounds, but I love that this review is sort of picking out all the things that I've been finding and identifying them as well, but not happy about it. I argue that the reviewer in the Athenaeum was right. The poet was aiming for singularity, for language that made the reader take notice of it. And as the reviewer observed, he did this through both antiquated language and innovation, as well as obsolete pronunciation and new compounds. In reviewing the 1842 volume, The Spectator reiterated the flaws that it saw in Tennyson's style, saying, "His diction is piebald with the spots of various times, an obsolete word here, a cant phrase there, and anon a vulgarism by way of being natural." Unquote. And although it was not intended as a compliment, I think that's clear to see, this critique summarizes rather well the variety of techniques that Tennyson's philological knowledge embedded into his poetry. His diction being piebald with the spots of various times is a rather amusing way of expressing my main thesis, that Tennyson's deep familiarity with the English language enabled and encouraged him to select words from across its history and across its homeland. Critics regularly objected to the resultant style. His inclination toward affected choice of phraseology, as one put it, got in the way of his natural genius, according to The Spectator. But this is one area in which Tennyson was not swayed by the opinion of others. He must have, although he does occasionally change specific examples that someone has complained about, but overall, he didn't change his methods. And he must have been especially invested in drawing on early English and etymological metaphors because he was doing so in defiance of critical opinion, to which he was otherwise very sensitive. So, to conclude, Tennyson's diction bears the marks of multiple philological and medievalist inclinations: reverence for earlier poets, a feeling of connection to the Anglo-Saxons as the center of English language and culture, a sense of his position in a process of continual linguistic evolution, and his role as a shaper of words. A philological interest in one's words is an interest in the relationship between the past and the life of a modern speaker. In his review of 1830's poems chiefly lyrical, Arthur Hallam wrote of his friend's ability to blend the past into the present. The author is well aware that the art of one generation cannot become that of another by any will or skill, but the artist may transfer the spirit of the past, making it a temporary form for his own spirit, and so effect a new and legitimate combination. Hallam summarized quite well Tennyson's philologically informed style. Although other poets of the period were also invested in the past of the English people and their language, Tennyson took an uncommonly balanced view of the changes that English had undergone. Rather than lamenting what had been supposedly lost from English, he obviously reveled in the abundance of words available or recoverable in his native tongue and used their nuances strategically. He drew attention to verbal origins while also appreciating that language was dynamic and subjective. Thus, although he had a philologist's awareness of the fragility of communication, and lots of critics have sort of found that there's a sort of anxiety lurking behind his use of words, he could retain a hopeful sense of the possibilities latent within those words. In revealing vital metaphors and historical uses, in finding the Anglo-Saxon echoes of his own speech, and presenting lexical curiosities plucked from many centuries, Tennyson placed himself in a long line of language crafters. He used philology to make himself, as Trench described the first humans to create words, a poet, a maker, that is, of things which were not before. Thank you so much for your attention.